In the elegant ambience of a high-end pizzeria, an old woman, 77 years old, dressed in simple clothes, walks through the door. The chatter and laughter of the patrons quiet down as disdainful looks are cast her way. Suddenly, her firm voice pierces the air, "This place only exists because of me." The words echo, silencing the room, leaving everyone stunned and speechless. Who is this woman who, with a mere statement, can stop time itself? The mystery of her presence turns contempt into curiosity. The pizzeria, named Bella Roma, was bustling that night. Every table was occupied, filled with the aroma of fresh, baked dough, and the air was alive with the murmur of conversations. The decor was classic, with soft lighting and a soothing soundtrack that created an atmosphere of luxury and tranquility. Marco, the manager, moved with precision, ensuring every detail was perfect, upholding the establishment's reputation for excellence. Just as he was overseeing a table reserved for local businesspeople, the door opened, revealing an unexpected guest. An elderly woman named Lucia entered, her steps slow, supported by a worn wooden cane. Her hunched shoulders bore the weight of years, and her tattered gray coat starkly contrasted with the affluent attire of the patrons. Immediately, murmurs spread. Anna and Paolo, a couple nearby, exchanged astonished glances, while others whispered disapprovingly, their eyes casting judgmental looks. In this elitist setting, Lucia seemed misplaced, an anomaly. What is she doing here? Anna whispered to Paolo, her tone judgmental. Maybe she's lost, he replied with a sarcastic smirk, watching Lucia make her way through the restaurant. Nico, one of the young waiters, watched from a distance, unsure how to handle the situation. He had never encountered a customer like this before. As Lucia moved towards the center of the room, the whispers grew louder, and the stares more intense, as if her presence was a disturbance to the harmony. Lucia paused, standing with a dignity that defied her humble appearance. She looked around, unfazed by the judgment, seeking an empty table. Nico, hesitantly, approached her. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, voice trembling, "may I help you?" Lucia met his gaze, her eyes hinting at a deep, untold story. "Yes, young man," she responded, her voice calm yet firm, "I would like a table, please." The waiter hesitated, aware of the clientele's expectations but unsure how to proceed. He glanced around for guidance until his eyes met Marco's, who was already approaching, his expression visibly irritated. "Good evening, madam," Marco greeted coldly, "may I ask what brings you here?" Lucia's serene eyes met his. "I'm here to dine," she replied quietly. Marco let out a short, sarcastic laugh, noticing the patrons now fixated on the scene. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe this is the kind of place for people like you," he said with a forced smile. The room fell into an almost complete silence, the tension palpable. Nico, standing beside Lucia, looked uncomfortable, unsure how to intervene. Marco, a man who prided himself on control, was clearly not going to let this anomaly disrupt his pizzeria. "I'm here because this place is important to me," Lucia said, her voice carrying unexpected calmness. Marco observed her with suspicion, his arms crossed. "Important to you?" he repeated mockingly, "and why is that?" Lucia sighed, her gaze scanning the room as if recalling a distant memory. Nico, intrigued, stepped forward but was halted by Marco's sharp gesture. "It's not about money," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "this place means more to me than you can imagine." The tension escalated. Anna and Paolo were now, along with the other customers, all holding their breath for the outcome of this confrontation. Marco, skeptical, tilted his head, his tone still dripping with condescension. "Madam, I think it's best if you find another place. We can't allow customers like you," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "like you to stay here." Lucia, however, was not ready to leave. I'm not going anywhere, she stated with unexpected firmness. Nico, unable to bear the discomfort any longer, stepped forward. Marco, maybe we should hear what she has to say, he suggested, his voice filled with respect for the woman who clearly had something significant to share. The air inside Bella Roma was thick with tension. Marco remained silent for a few seconds, staring at Lucia, determined to end the situation swiftly. The quiet laughter and malicious whispers from a few tables made the atmosphere even more uncomfortable. Anna and Paolo, from their table, continued to whisper, their amused glances suggesting they viewed the scene as entertainment. Marco, please, Nico said more emphatically, she's not causing any trouble. Maybe we should listen to her. Marco glared at him, his lips pressed tightly, clearly impatient with Nico's resistance. This isn't about listening to her, Nico. We're here to provide quality service. The lady here, unfortunately, doesn't seem to understand that our pizzeria has standards to uphold. Marco's words fell like stones in the already tense atmosphere. The audience, who had been whispering, now fell into a deeper silence, all eyes turning back to Lucia, waiting for her reaction, for any sign of weakness or acceptance of the humiliation. For a brief moment, Lucia was silent, observing the expressions on the faces that had judged her so swiftly. But what none knew was that she had faced far greater humiliations in her life. This pizzeria, these people, even Marco, would not break her. With surprising calmness, she looked directly at Marco. I'm not here to cause discomfort, she said, her voice firm and clear, I'm here because I have something to resolve. This place means a lot to me, more than you can imagine. Marco scoffed in disbelief, crossing his arms, leaning slightly forward. Madam, this is an expensive pizzeria. I don't think it's appropriate for someone who clearly can't afford our service. Lucia met his gaze with serenity, unfazed by his offensive words, as if she had heard it all before. Her eyes carried a depth few there could understand. What do you think you know about me? Lucia asked, her tone slightly provocative. You look at my clothes and judge that I don't belong here, but you're mistaken. The room grew quieter, if possible. Nico looked towards Marco for a reaction, but the manager seemed unsettled by Lucia's confidence. And what exactly would make me mistaken? Marco retorted, trying to maintain his composure. Before Lucia could respond, Anna and Paolo burst into laughter, their chuckles echoing through the room, drawing more attention. Oh please, Anna exclaimed, casting a disdainful look at Lucia, you don't belong in a place like this. I mean, just look at you. She gestured mockingly, and other customers began whispering again, shaking their heads in disapproval. Lucia remained still, like a rock amidst the tempest of criticism. Her eyes, however, stayed fixed on Marco. Nico, visibly uncomfortable, stepped closer to Lucia as if to shield her from the growing disdain. He knew this was wrong, but as a young employee, what could he do against the manager's orders? Marco, maybe, Nico began, but was cut off. No. Marco interrupted sharply, his expression now serious and intense, this lady has gone too far. If she can't pay, there's no place for her here. For a moment, it seemed like Lucia might succumb to the pressure, but she remained composed, her eyes now gleaming with determination. She knew this moment was crucial, she would no longer be humiliated. With surprising firmness, she addressed Marco directly, don't underestimate who I am, she said, her tone serious, this place, this pizzeria, only exists because of me. Those words struck the room like lightning. The laughter stopped instantly, and all eyes turned to Lucia, perplexed by her bold claim. Marco stood still, speechless for a brief moment, clearly confused. What do you mean? He murmured, surprised. Nico, sensing the weight of the revelation, looked at Lucia, waiting for further explanation. He knew there was more to this woman than anyone understood, and now everyone was captivated by this unexpected truth. The room fell silent once again, everyone waiting for Lucia's next words, eager to understand her claim. The atmosphere of mockery disappeared, replaced by a reluctant respect. Finally, Lucia took a deep breath and, with dignity, continued, "This place used to belong to me, many years ago." The revelation hit like a bomb. Shock was evident on every face, from Anna to Marco, who now began to realize that there was much more to this woman than he had assumed. Marco, still in shock, tried to regain his authoritative posture, needing to control the situation. He took a deep breath, stepped closer to Lucia, his eyes filled with suspicion. "What do you mean?" he asked with a dry laugh. "Are you suggesting that this pizzeria belongs to you?" Marco's tone still carried disdain, but now there was a note of uncertainty. He knew there was more to this story, something he didn't fully understand, but his pride wasn't ready to back down without a convincing explanation. Before Lucia could respond, a customer from a nearby table stood up. It was Lorenzo, a middle-aged man who had observed everything silently until now. He was known for his regular visits but kept a low profile. He approached Marco and Lucia with a thoughtful expression. "Perhaps we should hear her out," Lorenzo said, his voice calm but firm. That simple comment seemed to break the tension in the air. All eyes turned to him, curious about why such a respected customer would intervene on Lucia's behalf. Marco, visibly uncomfortable with the suggestion, hesitated. He knew Lorenzo was an influential customer, and losing his support could be detrimental. "Marco," Lorenzo continued, unshaken, "I believe there's more to this story than we're seeing. Don't you think we should at least hear what she has to say?" Marco, irritated by the intervention, hesitated. He knew Lorenzo's influence but was reluctant to yield. "And why does this interest you, Lorenzo?" Marco asked with a hint of disdain. Lorenzo maintained his composure, replying with an almost enigmatic tone, "Because many years ago, I heard about a woman who founded a pizzeria in this neighborhood when things were very different. It was a story my father used to tell, something about someone who worked hard to build a dream, but due to circumstances beyond her control, ended up losing everything. I always thought it was just a legend, but seeing this lady here," he looked at Lucia with respect, "I'm beginning to think that maybe this story is true." The room quieted further, the suspicion that Lucia might actually be the founder of Bella Roma spreading like wildfire among the customers. Nico couldn't hide his surprise. He looked at Lucia with renewed interest, imagining what she must have endured to reach this point. Marco, however, remained skeptical, reluctant to believe what he saw as an old woman's desperate bid for attention. "This is ridiculous," he said, crossing his arms again. "This pizzeria has been in my family for years. I've never heard of anyone named Lucia." Lucia observed him silently for a moment before responding, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "That's because you never cared to learn the real story of this place," she said. "The pizzeria wasn't bought by your family, it was sold when I lost everything." Lucia's words dropped like a heavy stone in the room. The audience, now completely engrossed, waited for more details. Lorenzo, on the other hand, seemed to be piecing together a puzzle in his mind, something from his youth making sense. "The pizzeria was mine," Lucia continued, her eyes shining with restrained sadness. "My husband, Antonio, and I founded this place. When we started, this neighborhood was very different. The streets were dirt roads, and few believed that something like this could prosper. But we believed, we worked day and night, sacrificed everything until he died, and then," she hesitated as if the memories were still too painful to express, "I lost everything." Absolute silence enveloped the room. Everyone was absorbed by every word Lucia spoke. Nico stood still, feeling a mix of compassion and regret for having judged her too quickly. The same feeling began to spread among the customers who had ridiculed her moments before. Marco, trying to process what he had just heard, felt the control of the situation slipping away. His rigid posture began to falter, unsure how to react. That's when Lorenzo took another step forward, looking directly at Lucia, his eyes now full of respect. "Antonio," he repeated the name, almost as if remembering something. "I've heard that name before. My father told me about a man named Antonio who, along with his wife, started this pizzeria." He spoke with admiration, said Antonio was a man of principles, and his wife. Lorenzo paused, staring intently at Lucia. His wife was a strong woman who never gave up no matter what happened. The room was now in total silence, waiting for Lucia's reaction. She looked at Lorenzo, clearly touched by his words. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling, "I am that woman." The emotions on Lucia's face were visible, and even Marco was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. The silence in Bella Roma was so deep you could hear the faint crackle of the wood in the oven at the back. All eyes were on Lucia, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Marco, stunned by the revelation, crossed his arms, trying to maintain his composure, but the cold confidence he had displayed minutes before was starting to crumble. Lucia, with tear-filled eyes but still standing firm, took a deep breath and continued her story. Her voice was lower, but each word carried an intensity that held everyone's attention. "Antonio and I were young when we started this pizzeria," she said, looking around the room as if reliving every moment in her mind. "Back then, this neighborhood was poor, and few believed that a pizzeria could survive here. But we had a dream. We worked non-stop, day and night, building what you see now. Every detail, every table, every brick in this place has a part of us in it." Nico, standing nearby, listened to those words with a lump in his throat. The simplicity and sincerity of Lucia deeply moved him. He would never have imagined that this woman, who seemed out of place when she walked in, had such a profound connection to the place. "But things changed," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "When Antonio died, the debts began to pile up. I fought, I tried to keep the pizzeria afloat, but I couldn't. I lost everything. I had to sell the pizzeria to pay the bills, and with that, my dream was taken away from me. The pizzeria, the place that meant everything to me, was handed over to someone else." She paused, trying to control the emotions that were overflowing. Her eyes met Marco's, who now looked somewhat confused, trying to process the information. Though he was reluctant to show it, even he was beginning to realize there might be truth to her story. "What are you saying?" Marco asked, his voice less authoritative than before. "Are you claiming that you are the founder of this pizzeria and that my family bought it from you?" Lucia nodded, her expression serene but her eyes revealing decades of pain. "Yes," she replied, "your father was the one who bought the pizzeria from me. At the time, I had no choice. I was left with nothing and was forced to live on the streets while this place thrived. My life fell apart. I spent years watching from afar, unable to do anything." The impact of those words was crushing. The customers who had looked down on Lucia earlier were now speechless, the discomfort in the room palpable. Even Anna, who had made disrespectful remarks before, seemed ashamed. Nico lowered his eyes, feeling guilty for having judged the old woman so quickly. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Lorenzo asked, his voice filled with admiration and respect. He had stepped even closer to Lucia, trying to understand the strength of this woman. "You could have come here before, claimed your place," he added. Lucia gave a slight, sad smile. "Sometimes life puts us in situations we can't control," she replied with a heavy sigh. "I lost my husband, my livelihood, my dignity. The streets were all I had left. Coming back here was never an option until today." Marco, who had remained silent, still seemed to resist the idea. For him, this revelation seemed impossible to process. How could his family have built a successful business on someone else's ruin? He needed more answers. "And what exactly do you want now, Lucia?" Marco asked, his tone softer than before but still cautious. "If what you're saying is true, why did you come back? What do you hope to gain from this?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Everyone present was eager to hear Lucia's answer. What did she want? Justice? Revenge? The right to reclaim what was once hers. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm not here for money or revenge," she said, her eyes softening. "I'm here for peace. I spent many years living in misery, feeding on bitterness and regrets, but today, I just want to close this chapter. This place means so much to me, and I just needed to come back here to see with my own eyes what I built and maybe to be treated with the respect that was denied to me for so long." The simplicity of her words touched everyone. There was no anger in her tone, no demands, just a deep desire to be recognized as part of this place's story. Nico, unable to remain silent any longer, stepped forward. "Lucia," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea you had such a deep connection to this place. I was quick to judge, and I apologize." Lucia's eyes softened as she looked at the young waiter. She nodded gently, accepting the apology with a comforting smile. Lorenzo looked at Marco with a firm expression, expecting him to do the same. Marco, clearly unsettled, looked at Lucia for a long moment, the resistance on his face fading. He finally muttered, "I didn't know. I apologize too." Marco's humility surprised everyone, but the biggest surprise was the slight smile that appeared on Lucia's face. "I don't want anyone here to feel guilty," she said softly, "I just wanted to be heard." The atmosphere had completely changed. Where there had once been disdain and laughter, now there was respect and empathy. Lucia, the woman who had lost everything, was finally being heard and recognized. Lorenzo, who had remained silently reflective after his earlier intervention, took a deep breath and stepped closer to Lucia once more. The man who had been just another customer in the pizzeria now seemed like a key figure in how things would unfold. He had felt something familiar in Lucia's story, something that connected him more deeply than anyone had imagined. "Lucia," he said softly, his voice filled with respect and quiet curiosity, "there's something you said that sparked a memory in me, something that has always been part of my father's stories." All eyes were now on Lorenzo, waiting for his next words. Even Marco, who had been leading the interaction so far, seemed disarmed, letting Lorenzo take the lead. "My father used to talk a lot about Antonio," Lorenzo continued, his eyes fixed on Lucia's. "He spoke with great respect for this man, saying he was one of the founders of one of the first successful businesses in this area. He always described him as hard-working, honest, and tireless, and he spoke of his wife with deep admiration. According to my father, she was the true force behind the success, a resilient woman, determined not to let her dream die." Lucia listened closely, her eyes brimming with tears as memories of the past resurfaced. Antonio's name always moved her, for it was more than just a memory, it was the embodiment of everything she had built and lost. Lorenzo paused for a moment, looking down as if gathering his thoughts, then lifted his eyes to meet Lucia's again. "I never knew the name of that woman," he said with a sad smile, "but today, hearing you tell your story, I'm beginning to think that perhaps that woman is you." Lorenzo's words echoed through the room, creating an even more intense atmosphere. There was something in the way he spoke that made everyone realize he wasn't just being kind, he deeply believed in the connection he was starting to make between his father's story and the woman standing before him. Lucia took a deep breath, touched by the recognition Lorenzo was giving her. It was as if after so many years of struggle and abandonment, someone was finally validating her story, her effort, and her pain. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling, "he was a friend of Antonio's. They used to meet here on the quieter nights to discuss how to turn this place into something grand. Antonio had so many dreams for this pizzeria, and I just wanted to help him make them come true. Marco, watching everything in silence, now seemed unsettled. He was finally beginning to understand the weight of Lucia's story and her connection to the pizzeria. He looked at Lorenzo as if seeking support or confirmation of what he was hearing, but Lorenzo didn't take his eyes off Lucia, absorbing every word. I vaguely remember the nights when my father would come home talking about the plans Antonio and his wife had for this place, Lorenzo continued. He said it wasn't just a pizzeria to them, it was their legacy, something they wanted to leave for future generations. Those words hit Lucia hard. A legacy, she had always dreamed of building something lasting, something that would transcend her own life, but with Antonio's death and the loss of the pizzeria, that dream had been shattered, leaving only memories and regrets. Marco, now without the arrogance that had characterized him at the beginning, took a step forward, his expression softer, almost humble. He began but hesitated, searching for the right words. I'm sorry for everything that happened to you, Lucia. I didn't know any of this. I swear, when my father gave me this pizzeria, he never mentioned, never spoke of Antonio or you. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I know this doesn't justify what you went through, but I'd like to apologize for what I said tonight and for what happened in the past. Lucia looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Everyone there was waiting for her reaction, and the silence was so deep you could hear everyone breathing. Finally, she gave a slight smile that carried both sadness and understanding. I don't blame you for not knowing, she said softly. Sometimes history gets lost between generations, and I never tried to reclaim this place. That's behind me. I just needed to come back here to close this chapter of my life. The pizzeria, once immersed in judgment and scorn, was now a place of understanding and reconciliation. Nico moved discreetly, serving a glass of water to Lucia as a small gesture of respect. She accepted the glass with gratitude, giving him a gentle look. Thank you, young man, she said, you have a good heart. Don't feel guilty about today. Lorenzo, still standing, looked at Lucia with something more than respect. He felt a deeper connection with this woman, one he couldn't fully explain yet. Something within him recognized that there was a bigger story between them, and he was determined to discover more. Lucia, he said, his voice now soft and full of empathy, I don't think your return here was a coincidence. Maybe there's still something left to uncover. What do you mean by that? Lucia asked, her voice low but filled with curiosity. The gentleness of her words contrasted with the silence around her, where everyone waited for her response. Lorenzo gave a slight smile as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle in his mind. My father used to talk a lot about Antonio and the work you both did to build this place, but he also mentioned something about a promise, some sort of agreement that your husband made before he passed. Something he never fully explained. Lucia frowned, trying to remember what Lorenzo was talking about. The memories of her time with Antonio were often blurry, filled with a mix of happy and painful moments, especially towards the end when his illness had begun to take over their lives. But a promise, an agreement. I don't remember any promise, Lucia said slowly. Antonio was so weak at the end, all he wanted was to make sure I was safe, that our pizzeria would survive even if he wasn't here anymore. Maybe that's what your father was talking about. Lorenzo nodded, clearly deep in thought. Maybe, but my father always talked about that agreement as something important, something that would ensure your legacy would never be lost. He was never very clear on what it was, but he always considered Antonio a man of his word, someone who wanted to make sure that everything you built would continue to exist even after he was gone. Lucia remained silent for a few moments, her eyes wandering around the walls of the pizzeria. The place was different from how she remembered it, but at the same time, every detail brought a wave of nostalgia. It was as if Antonio's spirit was still there, in every corner, at every table, watching over what had been done with their dream. If there was any kind of promise, she said, her voice soft, almost to herself, Antonio never had the chance to tell me everything. It all happened so fast in the end. The illness took him in such a devastating way that we barely had time for deep conversations. We just wanted to enjoy our last moments together. Nico, who had been silent until then, took a step forward, visibly moved by Lucia and Antonio's story. He was young, but the strength of the emotional connection Lucia had with the pizzeria and the past was palpable to him. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Lucia," he said, his voice full of respect. "I can't imagine what you went through, but I feel like there's something more here, something we might need to discover together." Lucia smiled slightly at the young waiter, sensing the sincerity in his words. There was a compassion in him that warmed her heart, something she hadn't expected to find that night, especially in this place. "Maybe that's it," she replied, looking at Nico with gratitude. "Maybe there's still something I need to discover about what we left behind." It was then that Marco, who had been keeping his distance, finally decided to step in. He seemed uncomfortable, but something in his eyes indicated that he was starting to see the situation differently. "I don't know about any promise, Lucia," Marco said, his voice hesitant, "but if there's something my father knew, I was never told. All I know is that he bought this pizzeria from you when the financial situation was complicated. If there was some sort of agreement, he never mentioned anything to me." Lucia looked at him with an understanding expression. She knew Marco was telling the truth. In all those years, she had never returned to the pizzeria, never tried to find out what happened after she left it. For her, that chapter of her life had closed the moment the sale was finalized. But now, maybe there was something more buried in the history of the place she loved so much. Lorenzo continued, "I don't mean to be intrusive, Marco, but I think we should try to find out more about this agreement. My father kept some papers, letters he exchanged with Antonio. Maybe there's something in them that can help us understand this story better." Lorenzo's suggestion brought a new energy to the room. Even the customers who had been absorbed in their meals or conversations earlier were now paying close attention to how the situation was unfolding, as if a new piece of a mystery was about to be revealed. Lucia, who had seemed resigned to the past, now felt a new spark ignite in her heart. The idea that there might be something she didn't know about Antonio's legacy and the pizzeria gave her a new sense of purpose. "I'd like to see those papers," she said finally, her voice trembling with the sudden hope rising within her. "Maybe Antonio left something I never knew about." Marco, seeing that he could no longer ignore the seriousness of the situation, let out a long sigh. He knew that as the manager of the pizzeria, he would have to allow this investigation to happen. After all, what was at stake wasn't just Lucia's past but also the future of the pizzeria he now managed. "All right," he said, finally giving in, "if there's something that needs to be uncovered, I'm willing to help." Lorenzo nodded, clearly pleased with Marco's response. He turned to Lucia with a gentle smile. "I'll look for my father's letters," he said. "Let's see if there's something that can give you the answers you've been looking for." Lucia's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness, they were of gratitude and hope. Perhaps, after so many years, she could finally find peace with the past and understand the true legacy she and Antonio had left behind. The next day, Lorenzo kept his promise. He returned to the pizzeria carrying a small, aged wooden box, his expression serious. He had spent hours sifting through the old letters and documents that belonged to his father, searching for any clue that might shed light on the agreement that had been made between Antonio and Lorenzo's father. When he entered the pizzeria, the box seemed to weigh more than expected, as if it carried the burden of decades of untold stories. Lucia was already there, sitting at a table near the window, with Nico nearby serving her a hot coffee. She looked anxious, but there was also a serenity about her that showed she was ready to close this chapter of her life, no matter what she discovered. Marco was on the other side of the room, watching from a distance, still processing the revelation that his pizzeria had been founded by the humble woman he had initially dismissed. "Here they are," Lorenzo said, placing the box gently on the table, "the letters my father kept. Some are just about business, but others might have the answer we're looking for." Lucia looked at the box with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. It was as if those letters were the key to unlocking all the repressed emotions she had carried over the years. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the box, revealing a stack of old letters, yellowed with age. Lorenzo pulled up a chair and sat beside Lucia, ready to help her go through the documents. Nico and Marco, though keeping their distance, stayed close, unable to look away as the letters were carefully unfolded. The first letter Lucia opened was one that Antonio had written to Lorenzo's father. She read it aloud, her voice trembling with the emotions she was trying to contain. "Dear friend, I hope this letter finds you well. The pizzeria is going as planned, and I believe we may soon expand. I thank you for your trust in me and Lucia. We couldn't have done this without your support. I hope we can continue this partnership for many years to come." Lucia paused for a moment, holding back tears as she read her husband's words. Antonio had always been a man of vision, someone who believed hard work would bring rewards, and for a time, they had thrived. Lorenzo picked up another letter and began to read. "Antonio, I've been reflecting on our conversation, and I believe we're on the right path. However, I understand your concern for the future, especially now that your health is declining. I want to assure you that, no matter what happens, I will be here to make sure your legacy continues. If anything happens, you have my word, I will take care of Lucia and the pizzeria as if they were my own." The final words of the letter hit everyone like a shock. Marco, who had been standing farther back, immediately straightened up, his eyes wide with surprise. This was the promise that had been mentioned. Lorenzo's father had promised to take care of both Lucia and the pizzeria if Antonio could no longer continue, and somehow that promise had been lost over time. "It can't be," Marco murmured, moving closer to the table where Lucia and Lorenzo were sitting. "My father never told me about this. He always said he bought the pizzeria, that it was his." Lorenzo looked at Marco with an understanding expression. "Maybe he tried to keep that promise for a while," he said, "but something happened, and the promise was forgotten or ignored." Lucia, still absorbing the words of the letter, closed her eyes for a moment. She finally understood what had happened. Lorenzo's father had indeed had good intentions, he had promised to protect her and Antonio's legacy, but somehow, that promise was lost over the years. "That explains why he never looked for me after I sold the pizzeria," Lucia said, her voice heavy with resignation. "He promised me something he never fulfilled." Marco was visibly uncomfortable. Everything he had believed about the origin of the pizzeria was being questioned at that moment. He now realized that his family had acquired the pizzeria, but not in the way he had always imagined. There was a moral debt that somehow had not been paid. "Lucia," Marco began hesitantly, "I'm sorry. If I had known, I would have done something. My father never told me about this promise." She looked at Marco, her eyes now shining with new clarity. The weight of decades of pain and regret seemed to finally be lifting. "I didn't come here to collect a debt," Lucia said, her voice firm but gentle. "I came because I needed to close this chapter. I needed to be recognized for what Antonio and I did, and I think now that you know the truth, I can finally find peace." Lucia's words deeply moved everyone there. Even the customers who had initially mocked her now looked at her with respect and admiration. Nico discreetly wiped his eyes, moved by the dignity of this woman who had come seeking only acknowledgement. But before the situation could fully come to a close, Lorenzo glanced again at the pile of letters in the box. "Wait, there's one more letter here," he said, pulling out an envelope that looked more recent than the others. He unfolded the paper, and his eyes widened as he read its contents. "Lucia, I think you need to see this." He handed her the letter, and as Lucia began to read, her expression changed. The words on that letter revealed something even more surprising, something no one had expected. As she read, her face showed a mix of shock and confusion. When she finished, she carefully placed the letter on the table as if it were a fragile object and looked at Lorenzo, who was watching her closely. "What does the letter say?" "Lucia?" Lorenzo asked, concern evident in his voice. For a moment, she didn't respond, memories flooding her mind, the weight of the words pressing heavily on her heart. Marco, now closer, also waited with anticipation. The previous revelation about his father's unfulfilled promise had already shaken his beliefs, but he sensed there was something even deeper in that last letter. Finally, Lucia spoke, her voice low and filled with emotion. "This letter, it's from Antonio. He wrote it before he died, but I never knew it existed." She paused, taking a deep breath as if needing strength to continue. "He knew his time was running out, and he wrote to your father, asking him to take care of not just the pizzeria but of something even more important." Everyone's eyes were fixed on Lucia, her words hanging in the air, the silence in the pizzeria so dense it felt like no one was even breathing. Lorenzo, visibly confused, furrowed his brow. "Something more important?" he asked, his expression intrigued. Lucia looked directly at Lorenzo, her eyes welling with tears. She placed her hand over the letter and with a trembling voice revealed, "Antonio spoke about you, Lorenzo. He knew your father had adopted a child years ago. He mentioned that your father was a loyal friend and that if anything happened, he hoped you, as his son, would come to know the truth about your origins." Lorenzo froze, shock written all over his face. He was speechless for a moment, his trembling hands resting on the table. The letter that revealed this information changed everything. For years, Lorenzo had lived with the certainty that he was the adopted son of the man who raised him, but he had never known of any connection to Antonio or Lucia. "What do you mean?" Lorenzo whispered, almost breathless, "What truth about my origins?" Lucia took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. The truth, hidden for so long, was finally coming to light, and she knew it wouldn't be easy to reveal. "Antonio never had the chance to tell you, but you are our son, Lorenzo," Lucia said in an emotional burst, her voice trembling with the pain of the revelation. "You were taken from us when you were still very young. Life was hard, and we couldn't afford to keep you. The man who raised you, the one to whom Antonio entrusted this letter, was our closest friend. He took care of you when we couldn't." Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. His mind was spinning, trying to process what he had just heard. Tears threatened to spill down his face as he struggled to gather his thoughts. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his identity, seemed to collapse in an instant. This can't be true," he murmured, shaking his head in denial. "I didn't know." Lucia reached out to him, her eyes filled with both tenderness and pain. "I know it's a lot to process, Lorenzo. I didn't even know Antonio had written this letter. If I had known, I would have sought you out much earlier. But now that you know the truth, I hope you understand that we have always loved you. We had to let you go to ensure you had a better life." The revelation weighed heavily on everyone in the pizzeria. The silence was almost suffocating. Even Marco, who had previously played the role of antagonist, was clearly moved by what he had just heard. He shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the story was much larger than any issues he had with Lucia. It was a truth that transcended decades of loss, longing, and secrets. "My God," Nico murmured from the back, unable to contain his surprise. He had been a spectator of the entire situation from the beginning, but now it felt like he was witnessing a true miracle. Lorenzo, still trying to absorb everything, the discovery overwhelming him, had been raised by another family, but now he found out his origins were deeply intertwined with the pizzeria and the woman he had defended, not knowing she was his mother. "You knew about this all along?" Lorenzo asked, his voice trembling. "Did you always know I was your son?" Lucia shook her head slowly. "No, Lorenzo. I knew you had been adopted, but I lost contact with your adoptive father after I sold the pizzeria. I didn't know where you were. I always hoped that one day fate would reunite us, but I never thought it would be like this." Tears began to stream down Lorenzo's face. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The truth weighed heavily on him. He finally stood up from his chair and walked over to Lucia, his heart racing. Without saying a word, he knelt before her, holding the hands of his biological mother. I don't know what to say," he whispered, looking into her eyes. "Everything I thought about my life changed in an instant, but thank you. Thank you for telling me the truth." Lucia, with tears streaming down her face, caressed Lorenzo's face with her trembling hand. The moment was so charged with emotion it felt like time had stopped for everyone there. "My son," she whispered, her voice filled with love, "you've finally come back to me." Marco, who was watching everything with teary eyes, stepped forward. He knew he needed to do something that would help right the historical wrong his family had committed. He knew he owed Lucia much more than words. "Lucia, Lorenzo," Marco began, his voice slightly breaking with emotion, "I want you to know that the pizzeria is as much yours as it is mine. My father may have bought it from you, Lucia, but today, with everything we've learned, it seems right that you come back to be a part of this again." Lucia and Lorenzo looked at each other, both still processing the revelations and Marco's offer, but one thing was certain, they had found each other again, and the pain of the past was finally beginning to heal. Marco's offer hung in the air like an unexpected breeze, bringing with it a promise of reconciliation and renewal. Everyone in the pizzeria fell silent, absorbing the deep meaning of those words. Lucia looked at Marco, her eyes misty but filled with serenity. For decades, she had carried the pain of losing her husband, her pizzeria, and, above all, her son. Now, it all seemed to finally connect in a way she had never imagined. "Marco, your words mean a lot to me," she said, her voice soft yet filled with emotion. "I never expected this. I came back here not to reclaim what was mine but to find peace. I wanted to see what this place had become, the dream that Antonio and I once had." Marco stepped forward, visibly touched by Lucia's words. He took a deep breath, as if about to make a confession. "I didn't know any of this, Lucia. I grew up hearing my father say that he bought the pizzeria, that he transformed it into what it is today. But after everything you've shared and after reading those letters, I realized there was more behind this story." He paused, and his expression became more serious. "The pizzeria has always belonged to you and Antonio. I can't change the past, but I can do what's in my power to correct the mistakes that were made." The silence in the pizzeria was almost reverent. The customers who had judged Lucia so quickly before now watched her with respect and admiration. The story of her life, her struggle, and her loss had touched each of them profoundly, and Marco's demeanor, which had initially been arrogant and indifferent, was now one of someone seeking redemption. Lorenzo, still kneeling beside Lucia, slowly got up and walked over to Marco. He paused for a moment, observing the man who, in a way, represented the side of the family that had taken over the pizzeria after the fall of his biological parents. But now, he saw Marco in a new light. "Marco, I don't know what to say," Lorenzo began, his voice filled with emotion. "This is all new to me. I just discovered that I am the son of Lucia and Antonio. But I think you're right. We can't change the past, but we can do what we can to honor what they built." Marco nodded, acknowledging the weight of those words. He knew that the decision to relinquish part of the control of the pizzeria would be a significant sacrifice for his family, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. As difficult as it was the only way to honor Antonio's memory and to fulfill the unkept promise of his own father. What I propose, Marco continued, is that the pizzeria returns to being a venture of both of you. I want you and Lucia to be part of this again, not just as guests but as partners. I want your legacy to continue and for Antonio's name to be remembered as the true founder of this place. Marco's offer was met with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Lorenzo looked at Lucia, trying to gauge her reaction. There was something magical about that moment, as if time was finally closing the cycle of decades of separation and pain. Marco, Lucia began, her voice firm yet filled with gratitude, what you're offering is something I never expected. But before I accept anything, I need you to understand one thing. I'm not after material possessions or revenge. I don't want to take anything from anyone. I just want it to be recognized and to know that everything Antonio and I built wasn't forgotten. She paused, her eyes fixed on Marco. If we're going to do this, I want it to be as Antonio always wanted, a place where people come not just for the food but for the of Bella Roma to be restored. Lucia's words deeply touched Marco. He knew that if there was a way to redeem his family and honor the broken promise, it would be through this, a place that celebrated not just commercial success but the history and sacrifice of those who built it from the beginning. I agree, Lucia, he said with a genuine smile, let's honor Antonio's dream and yours. From now on, Bella Roma will belong to both you and my family. Together, we'll ensure that the original spirit of this place never fades. A feeling of relief and satisfaction spread through the room. The cycle of decades of pain was finally closing in a way that no one could have predicted. Nico, who had observed everything closely, felt grateful to have witnessed the reconciliation and to have been a part of such a significant moment. Lorenzo moved closer to Lucia again, and this time, there was no hesitation in his gestures. He hugged her tightly like a son finally reuniting with his mother after years of separation. Their tears mingled, but they were tears of joy and healing. I love you, Mom, Lorenzo whispered, his words filled with emotion. I always knew I would find you again. My son, Lucia replied, her voice soft and full of love. Marco, watching the scene, took a deep breath. He had made the right decision by proposing the partnership with Lucia and Lorenzo. More than redeeming the past, he knew he was building a solid future for the pizzeria and restoring the true spirit that Antonio and Lucia had begun. The pizzeria would become more than just a place for fine dining, it would again be a space of history, community, and family. Now that everything is clear, Marco began, breaking the gentle silence that had settled over the place, we need to think about how we're going to move forward. I want everyone to know who you are and what the true story of Bella Roma is. I want Antonio's name to be prominent and for his and Lucia's story to be part of the restaurant's identity. Lucia smiled slightly, her hands still intertwined with Lorenzo's. She wasn't used to receiving so much attention, especially after so many years of being invisible to the world, but she knew Antonio would be proud of what was to come. I agree, she said softly, but I want it to be something natural. We don't need to turn the pizzeria into a museum of the past. Antonio's essence has always been here, in the little details, in the energy this place carries. Let's continue as we always have, but with more heart, more purpose. Nico, who had been watching everything with a heart full of admiration, stepped forward. Can I say something? He asked a bit shyly but feeling the need to express himself. All eyes turned to him, and Lucia nodded encouragingly. I've always worked here with great pride, but I never knew the true story behind Bella Roma. Knowing it now makes me want to give even more of myself to this place. Knowing that this pizzeria was built with so much sacrifice and love inspires me, and I want to be a part of it. I want to help you bring back that feeling, Nico said. His words moved everyone. Lucia looked at him tenderly, feeling the sincerity and kindness in the young man's heart. She knew that the future of the pizzeria was in good hands with people like him who understood and valued the true essence of what Bella Roma represented. Thank you, Nico, she said with a smile, people like you are the soul of this place, and we're happy to have you with us on this new journey. Marco, seeing everyone's sincere involvement, nodded feeling grateful for choosing the path of reconciliation. He knew that together, they could make the pizzeria thrive in an even more authentic and meaningful way. So it's decided, Marco said with renewed enthusiasm, from now on, Bella Roma will be managed by the three of us. Let's honor the past but also look to the future. Antonio's name will be etched in the history of this place, and Lucia, you will be part of every decision we make from here on out. Lorenzo smiled, still processing the weight of everything he had discovered about his life but feeling more determined than ever to be part of that legacy. I never thought I would return to this place as Antonio's son, he said, his voice filled with emotion, but now that I know the truth, I promise to honor my father and mother in the best way possible. Let's make Bella Roma everything they dreamed of. The atmosphere in the pizzeria was filled with a new energy. The remaining customers began to clap quietly, moved by what they had witnessed. Bella Roma was no longer just a restaurant, it was a symbol of overcoming challenges, reconciliation, and family. In the days that followed, the pizzeria underwent a subtle yet powerful transformation. A small mural was placed on one of the walls, telling the story of Antonio and Lucia, highlighting the importance of their contributions to the restaurant. Marco and Lorenzo began working together to revitalize the menu, bringing back some of Antonio's original recipes while Lucia oversaw everything with a satisfied smile, watching her lifelong dream being restored. The changes weren't radical, but the spirit of Bella Roma had shifted. Now, more than ever, the pizzeria was a place of unity, where everyone who walked in could feel the living history in the dishes, the walls, and the people who worked there. Lucia had found the peace she had long sought, and Lorenzo had finally discovered his true roots. The cycle that had begun so many decades ago was finally closing, not with pain and loss but with love and hope. The pizzeria Bella Roma, just like the story of Lucia and Antonio, would continue to thrive, not only as a business but as a legacy of resilience and reconnection between the past and the present.